Donovan Carter had always nurtured the dream of owning a home with a tranquil lagoon in the backyard, a space where he could escape the pressures of his day job. For years, he saved meticulously, cutting corners wherever possible. He often reminisced about childhood summers at distant relatives' houses, where the best memories included floating in a shimmering pool, the sun blazing overhead. The image of that carefree life propelled him through countless late nights and double shifts. At last, fortune aligned with Donovan's diligence. He secured a modest property in Stonebridge Glen, an upscale neighborhood known for its calm streets and well-kept sidewalks. And there, in the private garden courtyard, lay his dream, a modernized lagoon, complete with underwater lighting and a small stone waterfall. From the moment Donovan signed the final papers, he envisioned peaceful weekends spent gliding through the water, letting the weight of daily stress melt away. On weekdays, Donovan worked long hours at a bustling corporate office in the city center. Evenings, he often returned home exhausted. The new house provided solace, soft ambient lights illuminating the lagoon, inviting him for a few relaxing laps. The gentle gurgle of water soothed his frayed nerves. After a while, a routine emerged. Each night, he'd slip into his board shorts, grab a quick shower, then slide into the water. The rhythmic motion of swimming helped him decompress. The lagoon became more than a luxury, it was a therapeutic haven. Yet, as idyllic as Stonebridge Glen seemed, Donovan soon noticed subtle tensions. A few neighbors offered polite nods or distant waves, but for the most part, people kept to themselves behind gated fences. Though he wasn't particularly needy for social ties, Donovan found it odd that residents of such a quiet neighborhood seemed so guarded. He couldn't have guessed that trouble would soon emerge in the form of Margot Sinclair, a woman who also resided in Stonebridge Glen. In the earliest weeks, Donovan knew her only by sight. She drove a shiny SUV and wore a perpetual air of self-assuredness. Their interactions didn't extend beyond perfunctory greetings. If he sensed any mild hostility, he chalked it up to typical suburban aloofness. Nonetheless, Donovan tried to remain optimistic. He was living out the fantasy he'd held since childhood, an oasis in his backyard, a steady job, and a measure of quiet. If the neighbors weren't instantly warm, that might just be their way. He figured time would foster familiarity, and perhaps his lagoon would become a conversation starter, bridging the gap. What do you think? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. Little did he realize, that very lagoon would soon become the battlefield for a conflict shaped by entitlement and prejudice. In a matter of weeks, Donovan's peaceful routines would be upended by Margot's baseless assumptions and intrusions. But in this moment, those precious first nights, he savored blissful ignorance, reveling in the water's gentle lull as he looked at the stars. It was the calm before a storm, one that would test his patience, dignity, and sense of justice. After settling into his new life in Stonebridge Glen, Donovan Carter began to notice veiled hostility from Margot Sinclair, a resident living a few houses down. At first, he couldn't pinpoint why, but he sensed a certain edge in Margot's tone whenever they crossed paths, perhaps in the communal mailbox area or on a short stroll around the block. In fleeting encounters, Margot made comments that left Donovan uneasy. Once, she asked if he was visiting someone in the neighborhood. He politely replied he was a homeowner, and her reaction was a slight huff, as if unimpressed by his presence. Another time, she offhandedly remarked that his kind usually didn't stay long in Stonebridge Glen. Donovan tried to dismiss these remarks as misguided or ignorant, hoping not to see them escalate. But Margot's behavior soon exposed a deeper undercurrent. On a mild afternoon, Donovan was tidying the hedges flanking his property when Margot passed by on the sidewalk. She eyed him for a moment, then muttered something about how some people only bought lavish amenities to flaunt them, not because they belonged. The word stung, laced with unspoken bias. Donovan paused mid-snip, considering whether to respond. He opted to let it pass, believing stooping to an argument might grant more energy to her bigotry. Over the following days, Donovan noticed Margot's pattern of lurking around corners whenever he returned from the office. If they locked eyes, she'd stare pointedly, as though evaluating him. He tried to greet her with a civil nod, but she returned only a tight, disapproving smile. The more it happened, the clearer her prejudice became. She seemed fixated on Donovan's presence in Stonebridge Glen, as though she felt he didn't belong. Despite Margot's passive-aggressive stance, Donovan strove to remain focused on positive aspects of his life. He told himself that not everyone in the neighborhood shared her perspective, a few neighbors were cordial, if not particularly close. Meanwhile, his routine of evening swims in the private lagoon became an anchor for sanity. After a stressful day at work, he'd slide into the water, letting every hateful glance or muttered comment wash away. He considered confiding in someone, perhaps a coworker or an old friend from the city, but he dismissed the idea as overreacting. Margot's barbs, while unsettling, seemed small enough that he could endure them. He reasoned people had faced worse forms of discrimination, and maybe ignoring her remarks would starve them of attention. Donovan was determined to prove such petty bigotry wouldn't shake him. Yet, in his quiet moments by the lagoon, Donovan questioned how long he could pretend her negativity wasn't wearing on him. Each snide comment, each suspicious glare, planted seeds of resentment. At times, he found himself replaying Margot's insinuations about him and his kind in Stonebridge Glen. Was she simply threatened by a black man owning a refined property in a well-to-do neighborhood? Or did she harbor long-standing prejudices that manifested in these subtle jabs? He wished for a straightforward conversation, some chance to address her misgivings head-on. But each time they crossed paths, Margot's manner indicated she had no interest in bridging the gap. Instead, her remarks hovered in that space between outward politeness and inward malice, leaving Donovan to guess her ultimate intentions. Tragically, he wouldn't have to guess much longer. Her offhand remarks and watchful stares would soon escalate into blatant confrontation. And while Donovan braced himself for potential conflict, he couldn't predict the precise form it would take, nor how it would revolve around the very symbol of his personal success, his private lagoon. One sweltering afternoon, Donovan Carter ended his workday early, eager to recharge in the cool waters of his private lagoon. Pulling into his driveway, he envisioned a relaxed dip under the sun, the water rippling gently around him. Yet as he stepped into his backyard, he froze in disbelief. Stretched out on a lounge chair by the lagoon's edge lay Margot Sinclair, clad in a bright bathing suit and sunglasses, as though she owned the place. Donovan blinked, half suspecting he'd stumbled onto some bizarre dream. Margot turned her head slowly, meeting his astonished gaze with casual disdain. "You're back early," she observed, as if it were her yard to comment on. Donovan mustered an even tone, though anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Margot, what are you doing here?" he asked, forcing politeness. "This is my personal garden courtyard, not a communal area." She shrugged nonchalantly, swirling her toes in the lagoon's shallow end. "Don't be so uptight," she retorted. "I assumed Stonebridge Glen had shared perks. It's only fair we get to enjoy each other's amenities, especially something as fancy as this lagoon." Her words dripped with a subtle sneer, implying Donovan didn't deserve such a luxury. Taken aback, Donovan pressed on. "I've never heard of any communal lagoon rule in my deed. This is a private property. Please respect that." Instead of apologizing, Margot rolled her eyes. "Ha! Typical. You come into a neighborhood like this and act so proprietary. You have more than enough space for one person. Why not share?" Her tone reeked of condescension, layered with a suggestion that Donovan was an outsider unworthy of exclusivity. Seething inwardly, he tried maintaining composure. He calmly explained that he worked hard to purchase this home, and the lagoon was an integral part of his investment. Yet Margot refused to budge. "People like you," she spat, "should appreciate the courtesy of letting neighbors enjoy what they'll inevitably waste." Donovan stiffened, her phrasing, "people like you," stung with a racist undercurrent. Still, he resisted the urge to escalate. Eventually, he declared, voice firm, "I'm asking you to leave now, Margot. This is my personal space, not a public amenity." She let out an exasperated sigh, but rose from the lounger, gathering a towel she'd obviously taken from his supply. She strolled past him with a scoff, muttering, "So unneighborly." Then, as if delivering a final jab, she hissed, "Don't think this is over. I'll be back." Once the gate clanged shut behind her, Donovan exhaled in frustration. The gall. Margot had brazenly presumed she could lounge in his lagoon, dismissing any notion that she was trespassing. Worse, her thinly veiled commentary about Donovan's background and worth suggested deeper bigotry fueling her entitlement. Stunned, he dropped onto a nearby patio chair, trying to process the turn of events. Though Donovan eventually managed a brief swim, the once calm water felt tainted by tension. He found himself replaying Margot's words, each reeking of belittlement. This was no random misunderstanding, her statements had an edge of racial contempt. He realized with sinking clarity that ignoring Margot's mild jabs in the past had emboldened her to ramp up the intrusion. Over dinner, Donovan debated whether to lodge a formal complaint with the Stonebridge Glen Homeowners Association. But would that solve anything? He suspected Margot, arrogant as she was, might simply deny the incident or twist it into some tale of being invited. Without direct evidence, it could become her word versus his. Then again, doing nothing risked letting her continue barging in. He decided on a middle path, installing a basic security camera near the lagoon. If Margot attempted the same stunt again, he'd capture undeniable footage. Donovan spent the rest of the evening browsing camera systems online, ordering a discrete model that streamed to his phone. The idea of playing neighborhood watch in his own yard rankled him, but it seemed necessary to protect his haven from further intrusion. Days passed, and Donovan discovered small hints that Margot might be testing his resolve. A neighbor quietly mentioned seeing Margot lingering around Donovan's fence, scowling. Another neighbor recalled overhearing Margot grumble about certain folks flaunting wealth they didn't earn. Each snippet alarmed Donovan. He sensed a pattern of prejudice fueling Margot's desire to claim his lagoon. One balmy weekend afternoon, Donovan dared to invite two friends over for a barbecue. While they enjoyed grilled chicken and a light jazz playlist, Donovan spotted Margot pacing on the sidewalk out front, glaring pointedly at them. She never approached, but her presence was enough to dampen the mood. After his friends left, Donovan found a slip of paper at his door with a single line, "Don't push your luck." Shaken, he placed it in a folder, quietly building a record of Margot's intimidation. Despite these ominous signs, Donovan maintained hope that open conflict could be averted. He tried to stay polite if they crossed paths, offering a nod or a brief greeting. Margot, however, usually responded with scorn or refused to acknowledge him. In the back of his mind, Donovan recognized they were on a collision course. The brazen act of lounging by his lagoon was only the first of many aggressions she might employ. Late one evening, standing by the softly lit water, Donovan gazed at his reflection. He questioned how far Margot would go to prove her twisted sense of entitlement. If she believed she had a right to barge onto his property once, what was stopping her from doing something more drastic next time? The sense of intrusion clung to him, overshadowing the peaceful routine of a nighttime swim. He resolved to remain vigilant and prepared. If Margot returned, he'd have the security camera as proof. He'd gather every note, every witness statement, every instance of her vile commentary. No matter how unpleasant, Donovan promised himself he wouldn't let her bigotry or arrogance strip him of the one place he felt free. And in the stillness of that starry night, he also vowed to handle the situation with dignity, matching Margot's hostility with unwavering composure, determined not to let her break his spirit. Although Donovan Carter had grown used to subtle tension with Margot Sinclair, her trespassing at his private lagoon signaled a turning point. No longer content with side remarks, Margot had escalated to outright intrusion, followed by a litany of racist remarks and veiled threats. Donovan was sure she wasn't done. He found an odd mixture of dread and resolve swirling in his gut, dread that Margot might continue pushing boundaries, and resolve to stand firm if she did. Setting up the discreet security camera eased some anxiety. Positioned high on a porch beam, it monitored the lagoon area, streaming footage to Donovan's phone. If Margot tried the same brazen move again, Donovan would document it definitively. Days turned into a week with no direct confrontation, only fleeting glimpses of Margot scowling from across the street or rummaging through her trunk as Donovan left for work. Still, Donovan sensed a brooding anger from her. He took small steps to safeguard his property, double-checking the gate lock at night, making sure the camera was angled properly, and occasionally scanning the yard for signs of tampering. None of these tasks felt normal, yet they became a routine he learned to accept. Late one afternoon, Donovan arrived home to find the subtle drip of his garden hose unexpectedly turned on, soaking a patch of grass near the fence. Had Margot come by to open the spigot? Possibly. It was small mischief, but he recognized it as a tactic to unnerve him. He promptly turned off the water and added a note to his growing log of suspicious incidents, though the camera didn't catch the deed, maybe it was outside the lens range. He refused to let frustration show, though, he wanted to remain calm and measured. Then came the repeated phone calls to the local HOA line. Donovan discovered from a friendly board member that Margot had lodged multiple complaints about unapproved changes in his yard, claiming Donovan's lagoon broke some imaginary code. The board verified Donovan's compliance easily, dismissing her complaints. Donovan breathed relief that the official systems didn't automatically side with Margot, but the pattern was worrying. She was clearly testing every avenue to undermine him. One evening, Donovan's doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening it, he found a police officer, posture stiff. The officer explained they'd received an anonymous tip claiming Donovan was hosting loud parties, disturbing the neighbors. He surveyed Donovan's quiet living room, lights dim, no guests, and quickly surmised the call was bogus. Apologetic, the officer left, hinting they'd keep track of such nuisance calls if they continued. Donovan was grateful for the officer's politeness, though weariness settled in. Margot's harassment took many shapes. A few nights later, Donovan's phone buzzed with an alert from the lagoon camera. Checking the live feed, he saw a flicker of movement near the fence. Adjusting the resolution, he spotted Margot creeping along the perimeter, apparently scanning for a way in. She tried the gate latch, discovered it locked, then hopped on tiptoes as if peering over. The feed captured her muttering about Donovan being selfish. She soon gave up and stormed out of frame. Donovan saved the clip, relief washing over him that she hadn't forced her way inside. As disconcerting as her midnight prowls were, the biggest blow came one weekend afternoon. Donovan was relaxing on a lounger, sipping iced tea, when an object flew over the fence, splashing into the lagoon. Startled, he sat up, scanning for any sign of Margot, but she remained unseen. Fishing the object out, a small rock, he realized it could have seriously hurt him if it landed differently. Enough was enough, between the false HOA complaints, the random police calls, and now a projectile thrown onto his property, Donovan felt compelled to contact the authorities and file a formal harassment complaint. He shared his camera footage, the incident's log, and the recent rock throwing. The responding officer recognized a pattern of malicious targeting. A single incident might be minor, but cumulatively it revealed ongoing harassment. The officer said they'd document everything and recommended Donovan consider a restraining order if matters escalated further. Donovan thanked them, though he lamented how a pool he once viewed as a personal sanctuary had become a flashpoint for conflict. Meanwhile, Margot didn't let up. She left sticky notes on Donovan's fence, taunts about unearned luxuries, sometimes accompanied by slurs hinting at her prejudicial views. Donovan took pictures of each note. Furious as he was, he wanted to keep calm and gather evidence, not feed her bigotry with an emotional reaction. Some neighbors suggested Donovan rally them to collectively shame Margot into stopping, but he felt the legal route was more prudent. Finally, after weeks of vile remarks and property meddling, Donovan recalled an old idea he'd once overheard in jest, using an innocuous but deeply annoying substance, itch powder, to repel an unwanted intruder. Perhaps it was an unconventional method, but it promised a measure of nonviolent comeuppance if Margot dared trespass again. At first, he dismissed the thought as juvenile. But the more he endured Margot's provocations, the more a harmless but humiliating trick appealed to him. He reasoned that if she insisted on invading his lagoon, discovering an embarrassing itching sensation might deter her from returning. No permanent harm, just a teaching moment. The plan took shape as a last resort. He'd prefer it never come to that, but if she repeated her brazen trespassing, he'd be ready. With quiet resolve, he decided to buy a small pack of itch powder, stashing it discreetly in a pool house cabinet. Though slightly guilty about stooping to a prank, Donovan reminded himself that Margot had shown zero respect for reason or courtesy. If she insisted on forcing her presence onto his property, perhaps a comedic lesson awaited. He only hoped it wouldn't escalate into something worse. For now, he bided his time, camera rolling, waiting to see if Margot would cross that line again and find out just how irritating her next intrusion could be. After weeks of enduring Margot Sinclair's harassment, false complaints to the HOA, racial slurs muttered under her breath, even a rock hurled over the fence, Donovan Carter found himself wavering between frustration and fatigue. He had tried every amicable approach, politely asking her to respect his property, documenting suspicious activity, and even reaching out to local authorities with limited effect. Yet Margot persisted, her sense of entitlement and prejudice unabated. Late one evening, Donovan sat in his living room, thumbing through old notes about petty revenge tales he'd heard in his college days. It was half a joke to himself, a fleeting way to blow off steam. Among the pranks detailed was one about itch powder, a harmless but exasperating substance that induces relentless itching, primarily used to teach bullies a lesson without causing actual harm. He recalled how a friend once used it on an obnoxious roommate, leaving them scrambling for relief. Initially, the idea seemed too childish. Donovan prided himself on handling conflict civilly. But each day, Margot escalated her hostility. She'd curse under her breath when he walked by, or stomp along the perimeter of his yard, camera phone in hand, as if collecting evidence for some imagined wrongdoing. The local police had taken note of her false allegations, but short of catching her in the act of property damage, their hands were somewhat tied. Donovan craved a resolution that would make her realize the folly of repeatedly invading his yard, and especially his private lagoon. Eventually, desperation made the itch powder prank seem oddly appealing. It was non-lethal, non-damaging, and, he reasoned, would only activate if Margot trespassed in his lagoon again. Let her experience the consequences of her own brazenness. Chuckling in disbelief at his own train of thought, Donovan hopped online, searching for a place to purchase a small supply discreetly. He found a novelty website advertising Itch Pro powder. Mildly irritating, extremely hilarious. He placed an order, shipping it to a friend's address to keep the matter private. Even as he clicked complete purchase, he shook his head, half convinced he was stepping into comedic territory. While waiting for the powder to arrive, Donovan doubled down on daily life. He refused to cower inside his house. Each morning, he performed his laps in the lagoon, scanning the fence line for any sign of Margot. He still glimpsed her occasionally, glaring from across the street or behind her blinds, but she didn't scale the fence again, yet. Donovan suspected it was only a matter of time before she tried another brazen approach. When the small package arrived, Donovan carefully unwrapped it to reveal a plain plastic bag of fine pinkish grains, accompanied by a note that read, "Use sparingly. Avoid contact with eyes. Guaranteed to produce mild itching on skin." He stored it in a locked poolside cabinet, intending to use it only if Margot forced his hand. He still hoped the situation might resolve more politely. After all, if she never again trespassed, the powder would remain stashed away as a silent deterrent. But fate soon gave him the chance to deploy his plan. One sweltering Sunday afternoon, Donovan noticed footprints in the damp grass by his gate, fresh evidence that someone had tested the latch. That same evening, he discovered a note taped to his front door that read, "I'll be back in your pool when I choose. Quit acting like you own everything." The writing bore Margot's distinct angry slant. With tension coiling in his chest, Donovan retrieved the hidden itch powder bag. Carefully, under the dim porch light, he sprinkled a modest amount into the lagoon's filtration system. The water's chlorine levels and normal chemicals would dilute it somewhat, but he hoped enough would remain to produce an itchy effect if someone lingered in the water. Then he patiently waited, half anxious and half hopeful that Margot wouldn't indeed trespass. Yet part of him yearned for her to learn a lesson about the consequences of ignoring rightful ownership. For a while, nothing happened. Each day, Donovan checked the camera feed, but no sign of Margot entering the yard. He began second-guessing, maybe the presence of the camera had spooked her for good, or maybe she'd found some new method of torment. But one evening, as Donovan grilled chicken on the patio, he heard soft footsteps near the gate. Slipping quietly into his house, he checked the live camera feed. Sure enough, there was Margot, unfastening the latch. Somehow she'd undone the lock or used a copy of a key, and sneaking in wearing a robe and carrying a pool float. Heart pounding, Donovan watched from his living room monitor as Margot dropped the float into the lagoon, lowering herself into the water with a smug expression. She floated for a moment, apparently enjoying the forbidden dip. Donovan braced himself, recalling the itch powder. Would it take effect? Or had the water's chemicals neutralized it? Minutes passed. Margot's expression remained aloof, as if triumphant in her transgression. Then her brow furrowed. She scratched at her neck. Another moment, another scratch, this time at her arms. Donovan observed her agitation escalate. She looked around suspiciously, then scratched her legs. Soon, she fidgeted, muttering something to herself. He almost felt a twinge of guilt, but he reminded himself, she trespassed knowingly. As the itching intensified, Margot grew frantic, splashing water, cursing under her breath. She scrambled onto the pool deck, grabbing a towel. Yet the moment her towel brushed her inflamed skin, the sensation seemed to worsen. Panicked, she clutched her phone, presumably to dial 911. Donovan's feed captured her wide-eyed shock as she ranted about being poisoned, her face contorting with a mix of anger and fear. The bizarre plan had worked. Donovan realized the scene was comedic but also pitiful. In a sense, Margot had inflicted this on herself. He only hoped the police would see it for the harmless prank it was. Peeking outside, he heard Margot's raised voice, "My skin is on fire, he did this to me." Donovan steeled himself. The show was about to begin, and he had a trove of evidence proving Margot's trespass. Regardless, a wave of relief washed over him. Margot had tested his boundary once more, and soon enough, her consequences would unfold. Donovan just braced for the next steps: paramedics, police, false accusations. The comedic sting of itch powder belied the deeper truth: Margot's hateful sense of entitlement was culminating in a humiliating downfall. Donovan steeled himself, ready to calmly present the facts to authorities once they arrived, prepared to end Margot's harassment for good. The moment Margot Sinclair sank into the water of Donovan Carter's private lagoon that sweltering afternoon, she had no idea she was about to experience an excruciating sensation of itchiness. For weeks, Donovan had quietly endured her hostile antics, unauthorized entries into his backyard, racial slurs, and thinly veiled threats, until, at last, he decided to counter her harassment with a harmless but maddening prank. He sprinkled a small measure of itch powder into the lagoon's filtration system. It was a last resort, one he hoped would either discourage Margot from trespassing or at least make her think twice about harassing him again. Sure enough, Margot hopped over the fence in the sticky heat and eased herself into the lagoon, a smug expression on her face. At first, everything seemed normal. She floated languidly as if reveling in her victory, having outsmarted Donovan's security efforts yet again. Unbeknownst to her, the itch powder particles clung to her skin, gradually activating. Meanwhile, Donovan monitored everything from the discreet camera feed on his phone, heart pounding. He was torn between amusement at her ignorance and a twinge of guilt for orchestrating the ruse. Barely 5 minutes had passed when Margot started fidgeting, reaching up to scratch her shoulder. She frowned, squinting at the water's surface as if suspecting a stray insect had bitten her. Another minute and she raked her nails across her neck, confusion settling in. Donovan could see her shoulders tense through the camera's lens, her motions rapidly becoming more frantic. She splashed water in an attempt to soothe the itch, but the powder's effect only intensified upon contact with the inflamed skin. By the time she climbed onto the pool's edge, Margot was in full-blown panic mode, her face contorted, arms flailing in an attempt to relieve the torment. She grabbed a towel from the nearby table, but rubbing it over her body worsened the sensation. It wasn't long before she let out a sharp gasp, rummaging in her robe for her phone. Donovan felt his stomach tighten, she was dialing 911. Voice trembling and breath labored, Margot cried into the phone, "I'm at Stonebridge Glen, and I've been poisoned. He put something in the water. My skin is burning." She described intense itching as though it were a life-threatening condition, making little mention of her trespassing. The 911 dispatcher asked for details, but Margot's words were erratic, painting Donovan as a malicious villain. All the while, Donovan stayed hidden inside his house, phone in hand, capturing everything on his security feed. It took only a few minutes for the faint wail of sirens to echo down the quiet suburban street. A police car pulled up, followed shortly by an ambulance. Donovan, heart pounding, peered through a window as uniformed officers and paramedics hurried into his backyard. Margot's voice rose in the humid air, railing that Donovan had spiked his lagoon water. She howled about excruciating discomfort, her skin reddened from incessant scratching. Cautiously stepping outside, Donovan tried to project calm. An officer turned to him, brow furrowed. "Sir, Miss Sinclair says you intentionally poisoned her. We need an explanation." Donovan maintained a measured tone, explaining that Margot had been trespassing multiple times, ignoring property lines, and that he'd placed a mild irritant in the lagoon water, one that was non-toxic but designed to be extremely uncomfortable. He offered to show them the packaging for the itch powder and the receipts. The paramedics, meanwhile, examined Margot's skin, noting that she displayed no chemical burns or signs of severe poisoning, just inflamed, irritated patches indicative of a skin reaction. Margot grew incensed, lashing out verbally. "This is assault," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Donovan. "You can't booby-trap a pool, are you insane?" Donovan took a breath, then calmly recounted her trespasses, including footage from his phone showing her vaulting the fence and entering the lagoon. The officer scrolled through the clips, Margot creeping in, rummaging around, eventually plopping into the water, ignoring the "private property" sign. Even her meltdown was captured, from her frantic splashing to her phone call. It painted a clear portrait of how she had essentially triggered the prank by violating Donovan's property. While the paramedics concluded Margot's condition was not life-threatening, one of the officers asked Donovan if he understood the risks in using such a prank. Donovan nodded, acknowledging it was unconventional and borderline questionable. But he stressed that he hadn't intended true harm, just a deterrent, a comedic measure to protect his domain after repeated harassment. Another officer stepped aside to radio dispatch, presumably updating them that the situation involved no real poisoning but a bizarre neighborly feud. As the reality sank in, Margot's hysteria surged. She pointed at Donovan, calling him a dangerous maniac who needed to be arrested for attempted murder. Her shrill accusations, however, clashed with the paramedics' assessment and the incriminating video. The officer tried to defuse the situation, but Margot refused to settle down, hurling slurs at Donovan and even swiping at him physically when he calmly offered to get more proof of her past trespasses. That assault attempt sealed it. Another officer stepped in, forcibly restraining Margot, telling her she was under arrest for making false reports and for violent behavior at the scene. Donovan stepped back, breath unsteady, half appalled and half relieved. This entire meltdown, triggered by a harmless itch powder stunt, had laid bare Margot's entrenched aggression. The paramedics treated Margot's itching with a standard topical cream, advising her to wash thoroughly to remove any residue. She spat insults at Donovan as the officers led her away, red-faced and furious. The entire block, alerted by sirens, witnessed the spectacle, some filming on their phones. Donovan offered the officers his contact details and let out a long exhale. He was prepared to face potential consequences for the prank, but the police, after a cursory review, seemed more alarmed by Margot's unhinged attack than Donovan's use of a mild irritant on his own property. As the police cruiser pulled out of Stonebridge Glen, Donovan stood in the empty backyard, the lagoon's surface calm once more. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, guilt at stooping to such tactics, but also relief that Margot's assault and mania had exposed the truth of her harassment. From this bizarre scenario, it appeared he might finally find respite. For the first time in weeks, Donovan dared to envision a quiet, untroubled existence in his suburban refuge, liberated from Margot Sinclair's hateful sense of entitlement. Chaos gripped Stonebridge Glen as word spread of Margot Sinclair's meltdown and subsequent arrest. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some venturing onto their porches to witness the aftermath. Donovan Carter, still rattled but resolute, watched the flashing lights of the police cruiser disappear down the tree-lined avenue. He never intended his pool to become the stage for such a dramatic altercation, yet here he was, with adrenaline pulsing through his veins. Moments after Margot was driven away, two police officers approached Donovan. Their demeanor was calm, almost sympathetic. "We appreciate your cooperation," one said, referencing the camera footage and the backlog of evidence Donovan had meticulously compiled. The other asked if Donovan needed any medical attention. Though Margot's physical assault was brief, they wanted to confirm he wasn't hurt. Donovan shook his head, stating he was unharmed. The officer also inquired about the nature of the substance in the lagoon, ensuring Donovan clarified it was a harmless irritant, itch powder, not an actual toxin. Satisfied no serious harm was intended, the officers advised him to remain available for further statements. With the police gone, neighbors converged in hushed clusters, eyes wide with shock. Some tentatively approached Donovan's gate, their curiosity piqued. Normally private, Stonebridge Glen rarely witnessed such scenes. A handful offered words of support, expressing relief that Margot's aggression was finally addressed. Others timidly asked, "Are you okay?" or "What exactly happened?" Donovan answered in measured tones, "Margot trespassed, succumbed to a harmless but irritating prank, and then violently lashed out when confronted by the police." The crowd parted soon after, leaving Donovan alone to process the surreal events. He retreated into his home, sinking onto the living room couch. The memory of Margot's shrieking accusations and the scramble of paramedics replayed in his mind. In a swirl of emotions. Guilt for orchestrating the powder prank, relief that the police recognized Margot's aggression, and a faint sense of triumph that justice seemed to have prevailed, Donovan's body felt drained. He needed a moment to reflect on what had transpired and what might unfold next. Early the next morning, the rumor mill in Stonebridge Glen accelerated. Some neighbors found Margot's meltdown comedic, an over-the-top reaction revealing her prejudiced personality. Others worried about potential repercussions. Would she post bail and return, vowing vengeance? Did the arrest signify a final resolution or a stepping stone to further conflict? Donovan, finishing his coffee, braced himself for the possibility of new drama. At least now, Margot's record included evidence of her unhinged behavior, which might dissuade her from further harassment. Later that afternoon, Donovan received a phone call from an officer named Sergeant Ruiz, who had overseen Margot's booking. Ruiz said Margot faced charges of assault, misuse of emergency services, and trespassing. They also indicated Margot might attempt to spin the narrative as victimhood, claiming Donovan poisoned her. Donovan explained everything again, referencing the documented pattern of racism, false reports, and property intrusion. Ruiz thanked him, stating a thorough investigation would clarify the real story. News of Margot's arrest reached local media in a modest form, a brief mention in the regional news feed about a Stonebridge Glen resident causing a scene over disputed property access. Though no names were used, it was enough to spark quiet talk among residents. Donovan preferred not to become the focus of local gossip, but he was well aware that controlling the rumor mill was impossible. At least the coverage didn't paint him negatively. His neighbors who witnessed the fiasco seemed to confirm Margot's meltdown was the real highlight. 2 days later, an impromptu neighborhood meeting took place at the Stonebridge Glen Community Center. The Oakbridge Council summoned concerned residents to discuss recent events, aiming to restore calm and reaffirm that private pools were not up for debate. Donovan attended, still guarded about publicly admitting his role in the itch powder scheme. As soon as he stepped into the meeting hall, he felt eyes on him, some grateful, some curious. The council addressed general guidelines on property rights and harassment prevention. They also politely insisted that if any neighbor felt an incident warranted police attention, they should weigh carefully the validity of their claim to avoid 911 abuse. A few residents spoke up, condemning racism and acknowledging Donovan's right to defend his domain. Meanwhile, a minority voiced discomfort at the comedic means used to deter Margot. One older woman mumbled about unorthodox tactics, but when asked directly, she conceded Margot's extremes had overshadowed any moral debate about pranks. The consensus was that the larger issue, Margot's consistent bigotry and aggression, justified Donovan's desperation, even if the method was unconventional. By meeting's end, Donovan sensed Stonebridge Glen's moral stance was resolute: the community wouldn't tolerate entitled or hateful intrusions. The council assured him they'd work with local police to keep an eye out for suspicious behavior around his property. Buoyed by supportive words, Donovan walked home with a lighter heart. Perhaps, for the first time, the neighbors saw him not just as the quiet homeowner with a fancy lagoon, but as someone who stood firm against injustice. All that lingered now was the question of how the legal process would unfold. Donovan expected to be contacted again by the police or a district attorney, who might want him to testify if Margot disputed the allegations. He was prepared, phone clips and statements in tow. The only uncertainty was whether Margot, if she posted bail, would attempt to lash out again. Yet Donovan refused to cower. He took a new seat by the lagoon, gazing at the calm ripples. The water reflected a man who'd confronted prejudice in a clever yet non-lethal way. The swirl of guilt he once felt about employing itch powder diminished, replaced by the conviction that Margot's meltdown ultimately revealed her true nature. The comedic finale, captured by camera and witnessed by neighbors, left little doubt about who the real victim was. As the sun set that evening, Donovan exhaled a soft sigh of relief. He still felt the aftershocks of confrontation, but a stronger sense of peace anchored him. The pool, once overshadowed by worry, had become a symbol of resilience. Margot's arrest, in all its bizarre drama, would stand as a turning point. In the hush that followed, Donovan mentally prepared for any next steps, determined that no matter how the legal details played out, he wouldn't allow bigotry or entitlement to strip him of his well-earned sanctuary. The scene at Stonebridge Glen had shifted from a serene suburban afternoon to a flurry of sirens and flashing lights in a matter of minutes. Donovan Carter, braced for confrontation, stood near the back door of his home while paramedics and uniformed officers arrived to address the chaotic situation. On the far side of his private lagoon, Margot Sinclair trembled in an agitated blend of rage and panic, her skin splotched red as she complained about poisoned water and an attack on her person. What had begun as an eccentric plan by Donovan, sprinkling harmless itch powder into the lagoon, had erupted into a major incident. As the first responders assessed the scene, Donovan explained the full story. Margot had trespassed, he had used a mild irritant to deter her, and her exaggerated reaction had led to her frantic 911 call. One of the officers, Officer Daniels, asked Donovan to step aside and provide a calm, detailed account of events. Donovan showed the man the packaging for the itch powder and his phone security footage. From Donovan's vantage point, he could see Margot trying to cling to one of the paramedics, loudly insisting on urgent help. "My skin is on fire," she moaned. "He put chemicals in the water, he tried to kill me." The paramedic, however, noted that her vitals were stable, and the rashes on her arms looked more like contact irritation than any sort of lethal poisoning. Meanwhile, another officer hovered near Margot, listening with an increasingly skeptical expression as she accused Donovan of setting a trap in violation of the community's guidelines. When Officer Daniels returned to Donovan, he weighed the packaging for the itch powder in his hand, reading the label that identified it as a novelty product. You're telling me it causes intense itching but isn't toxic, correct? Donovan nodded, clarifying that it was a harmless prank. I only resorted to this because she kept trespassing and ignoring repeated warnings, he explained softly. I wanted a non-violent way to make her realize she can't just come onto my property. The conversation turned to the bigger picture. The officers recognized Donovan's frustration over Margot's ongoing harassment, including baseless phone calls to the police and hateful comments. Donovan handed over the entire collection of evidence, printouts of suspicious notes Margot left, footage of her previous intrusions, and logs of false 911 calls. One of the officers, Officer Powell, reviewed these documents, remarking that it certainly portrayed Margot as a chronic troublemaker. Meanwhile, Margot continued her tirade under the paramedics' watchful eye. She claimed she was the real victim, painting Donovan as a sinister figure who rigged his lagoon to harm unsuspecting neighbors. But the paramedics merely offered her basic skin relief, shaking their heads at her accusation of poisoning. A second officer decided to question her more thoroughly, noticing how her story changed each time she spoke. She insisted she had every right to use the pool, referencing non-existent community rules. The mood shifted sharply when Margot, in a fit of exasperation, stormed across the lawn to confront Donovan, ignoring the officer's pleas for calm. She pointed a trembling finger at him, screeching, "You'll pay for this." In one swift motion, she tried to shove him, though Donovan sidestepped, startled. Officer Daniels intervened instantly, grabbing Margot by the arm, warning her she was risking an arrest if she didn't stop. But the itch powder's effect, combined with her fury, drove Margot to lash out again, swinging her free arm wildly. This time, she struck Donovan's shoulder, though not with serious force. That final assault was enough. Officer Daniels and Officer Powell secured Margot, informing her she was under arrest for assault and for misusing emergency services. Donovan stood aside, his heart pounding, as they cuffed her. Half the neighborhood, alerted by sirens and commotion, looked on in stunned silence from behind fences. Some recorded videos on their phones. Margot's shrill protests, "He trapped me," and "I'm the victim here," rang hollow against the backdrop of paramedics, who had already reported that her so-called poisoning was merely an irritant reaction. It was a bizarre tableau, a respectable gated community turned into the stage for a meltdown triggered by bigotry, entitlement, and a small bag of itching powder. As Margot was led away to a waiting police cruiser, her indignation still flared. She hurled one last slew of threats in Donovan's direction, but the crowd's reaction made her words meaningless. Some onlookers murmured their approval of how calmly Donovan had handled himself, a few wearing concerned expressions realized they, too, had perceived Margot's hateful undertones in prior interactions. Exhaling slowly, Donovan approached the officers. They reassured him that, from their perspective, Margot's repeated trespasses and her physical assault overshadowed any potential issue with his mild prank. While the law might frown on booby traps, the context, her malicious harassment and disregard for lawful boundaries, made it clear that Donovan acted out of frustration but hadn't intended genuine harm. As the paramedics packed up and the police cruiser pulled away, Donovan found himself surrounded by a wave of subdued neighbors offering quiet support. Returning to his lagoon, Donovan gazed at the faint ripples under the setting sun. A swirl of thoughts crowded his mind, relief that the confrontation ended without severe injury, amazement at the comedic effect of the powder, guilt over stooping to a prank, and satisfaction that Margot's aggression had finally been recognized and stopped. In a single evening, months of hostility culminated in her public downfall. With Margot gone, Donovan could at last breathe easily in his own space. He realized the next steps would involve potential charges against Margot for false reporting, assault, and repeated trespass. Possibly, there would be statements to the Oakbridge Council or even a follow-up hearing. But for the moment, Donovan felt the tension slip from his shoulders. His quiet lagoon, the symbol of his personal success, had become the key to exposing Margot's racist entitlement. As dusk fell over Stonebridge Glen, Donovan's simmering anxieties faded, replaced by an emerging peace and the sense that, just maybe, his cunning ploy had secured the life he deserved. The days following Margot Sinclair's arrest brought a peculiar stillness to Stonebridge Glen. Neighbors who once seemed indifferent or wary now gave Donovan Carter respectful nods and empathetic smiles, recognizing the ordeal he'd endured at Margot's hands. In a twist of fate, the comedic sting of the itch powder had peeled away her veneer of propriety, revealing the deeper prejudice driving her actions. At first, Donovan grappled with mixed emotions, triumph in seeing Margot's hateful tactics thwarted, and lingering guilt over resorting to a prank, however mild. But as he recounted the events to friends, they commended his measured approach. Rather than lashing out or letting resentment fester, he employed something relatively harmless that forced Margot's hostility into full public view. In the end, her meltdown and assault ensured the blame landed squarely on her. Word spread that Margot would face charges for assaulting Donovan and repeatedly misusing 911. A few neighbors whispered about potential lawsuits against her, though Donovan wasn't certain how far the authorities would go. He had enough relief simply knowing she couldn't walk around as though she owned his lagoon. Even the Oakbridge Council, once aloof to the conflict, openly stated that private property rights in Stonebridge Glen were sacrosanct, and anyone ignoring them could expect legal repercussions. Meanwhile, Donovan's life settled into the peaceful rhythm he'd originally envisioned. Each morning, he resumed his languid swims, the water reflecting only calm skies and a fresh sense of liberation. No more glances over the fence, no more anxious scanning of security feeds, though he still kept the camera up, more out of caution than worry. When he hosted a small barbecue to celebrate the end of the turmoil, several neighbors attended, admitting they'd felt unease about Margot's bigotry but never knew how to intervene. In a sense, Donovan's stand encouraged them to speak out against subtle prejudice in the neighborhood. At last, Stonebridge Glen felt like the community Donovan had hoped for, a place where he could thrive without fear of intrusion. He recognized that bigotry could emerge anywhere, but this outcome proved that quiet determination and a bit of cleverness could expose it for what it was. Standing by the lagoon one evening, Donovan reflected on the entire arc of conflict, from random insults to outrageous 911 calls, culminating in a comedic but revelatory meltdown. It all underscored that sometimes the best solution to a hateful, entitled neighbor wasn't confrontation or aggression, but a cunning spotlight that let them ruin their own credibility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Donovan allowed himself a proud, serene smile. For all the tension he'd endured, he'd secured his home and property on his own terms, revealing the hypocrisy of a bully who sought to claim what wasn't hers. Now, the lagoon was solely his again, untouched by trespassers, untainted by fear. And, in the hush of a Stonebridge Glen dusk, he savored the hard-won victory that proved his quiet resilience was indeed stronger than any malicious neighbor's entitlement. A year after the tumultuous incidents that had rocked Stonebridge Glen, Donovan Carter finally found himself basking in the tranquility he had long fought to reclaim. The memory of Margot Sinclair's relentless harassment, her outrageous 911 calls, and her failed attempts at intruding on his private lagoon had gradually faded into a cautionary tale, a story that now circulated in quiet whispers among neighbors. Every morning, as the sun rose over the manicured hedges, Donovan began his day with a refreshing swim in his once tortured lagoon. The water, now undisturbed by intrusive eyes or booby-trapped pranks, shimmered in the early light, reflecting a renewed sense of peace. Gone were the days when he would anxiously check his security feeds or brace for the inevitable confrontation with Margot. Instead, he savored the simple pleasure of uninterrupted laps, the gentle ripple of water providing a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. In the months following Margot's arrest and the subsequent legal proceedings, the atmosphere in Stonebridge Glen had visibly transformed. The Oakbridge Council, having been embarrassed by its earlier leniency toward baseless complaints, had overhauled its policies to better protect individual property rights. New guidelines were implemented, ensuring that no resident's private amenities could be infringed upon. The revised rules fostered a sense of fairness that resonated deeply with the community, and even those who had once turned a blind eye began to speak out against any form of unwarranted intrusion. Donovan's victory, both in court and in reclaiming his space, became a subtle source of inspiration for his neighbors. At community gatherings and monthly meetings, residents recalled the saga of the intruder who had dared call the police over a private pool, and many expressed their gratitude for the courage it took to stand up against bullying. Some even credited Donovan for igniting a broader conversation about respect and personal boundaries in the community. On one crisp autumn evening, as Donovan sat on his back porch watching the sun sink behind the tall hedges, he reflected on the journey he had endured. His private lagoon, once a battleground of hostility and racist entitlement, now symbolized resilience and renewal. He recalled the bitter sting of false accusations, the anxiety of every unwelcome intrusion, and the strange, humorous twist of using a harmless prank to expose a hateful nature. Those turbulent days had taught him that standing up for one's rights, no matter how small the matter, could forge lasting change. Now, as twilight cast a soft glow over Stonebridge Glen, Donovan felt a deep sense of satisfaction and hope. He knew that while challenges might arise in the future, the lessons learned from that difficult chapter would continue to guide him. With renewed strength, he resolved to maintain the peace he had earned and to foster a community where respect prevailed over entitlement. In that quiet moment, with the gentle hum of the neighborhood in the background, Donovan Carter finally embraced the serene life he had long dreamed of, a life defined not by conflict, but by unity and quiet triumph. Hey everyone! If you found this story powerful and meaningful, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell to never miss our thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, educate, and challenge perspectives. Thank you for being part of this journey.